Hi friends, continuing to the channel The World Without Us. New York City Transit, Paul Schubert and Peter Bifra, a superintendent of the Hydrosolis and the Level 1 Maintenance Superior of Hydrosolis Emergency Response, respectively, understand perfectly how this would work. Every day, they must keep 13 million gallons of water from overpowering New York's subway tunnels. That's just the water they have already underground, notes the scubber. When it's rained, the amount is Brifa shows his palm. Surrounding it is incalculable. Maybe not actually incalculable, but it doesn't rain anyways, less now than before the city was built. Once Manhattan was 27 square miles of a porous ground interlaid with a living root that siphoned the 47.2 inches of average annual rainfall up trees and its meadow grasses, which dark there fill and exalt the rest back into the atmosphere. Whatever the roots didn't take settle into the island's water table. In places, it surfaced in the lakes and marshes with a excess draining off to the ocean via those 40 streams which now lie excess draining off to the oceans via those 40 streams which now lie trapped beneath concentrate and assaults. Today, because there is little soil to absorb rainfall or vegetation to transpire it, and because buildings block sunlight from evaporating it, rain collects its puddles or follow the gravity down skewers, or it flows into the subway vents, adding to the water already down there below 131st Street and Lenox Avenue, for example. A rise underground river is corroding the bottom of A, B, C, and the D subway lines. Constantly, men in refluxing west and dinin rough outs like a scubbers and briefa or clambering around beneath the city to deal with the fact that under New York groundwater is always rising. Whenever it rains hard, sewage clog with a storm debris. The number of the plastic garbages bag adrift in the world's city may truly exceed calculations, and the water needing to go somewhere pops down the nearest subway stairs. As the northeaster and the shirring Atlantic Ocean banks against the New York water table until in the place like the water states in the lower Manhattan or Yankee Stadium in the Bronx. It's back up right into the tunnel, shutting everything down until it subsides. Should the ocean continue to warm and rise even faster than the current inch per decade, at some point it simply won't subside. Shoulders and the briefer have no idea what will happen then. Add to all that the 1930s vintage water mains that frequency burst, and the only thing that has kept New York from flooding already, it is in intensity violence of its subway groove and 753 pumps. Thinks about those pumps. New York's subway system, an engineering marvel in 1903, was laid underneath an already existing burgeoning city, as that the city already here had sewer lines. The only place for subways to go was below them. So explains the scrubber, we have to pump uphill. In this, New York is not alone. Cities like London, Moscow, Washington builds their subways far deeper, often to double as the bomb shelters. Therein lies much potential disasters. Shading his eyes with his white hard hat, Scrubber peers down into an square pit beneath the Van Sillen Avenue station in Brooklyn, where each minute 650 gallons of natural groundwater gush from the bedrock. Gesturing over the roaring cascade, he indicates four submersible cast iron pumps that takes runs, laboring against the gravity to stay ahead. Such pumps runs on electricity. When the power fails, things can get difficulty very waste. Following the World Trade Center attack, an emergency pump train bearing a jumbo portable diesel generator pumped out 27 times the volume of an Shea Stadium. Had the Hudson River actually burst through the path train tunnel that connects New York subway to New Jersey, as was greatly feared the pump trains, and possibly much of the city would simply have been overwhelmed. In an abounding city, there would be no one like an Paul Scrubber and Peter Briffa to race from the station to flooded station whenever more than 2 inches of rainfall, as happens lately with an disturbing frequency, sometimes snacking hose ups stairways to pump to and sweeter down the street, sometimes navigating these tunnels in inflate boats. With no people, there would also be no power. The pumps will go off and stay off. When this pumps facility shuts down, says Scubber, in half an hour, water reaches a level where the train can't pass anymore. Briffa removes his safety goggles and rubs his eyes. A flood in one zone would push water into the others. Within 36 hours, the whole thing could fill. Even if it weren't raining, with the subway pumps still, that would have no more than a couple of a day that esteemed. At that point, water would start curling away soil under the pavement. Before the long streets starts to crater, with no one uncalling sewers, some new water sources forms on the surface. Others appears suddenly as an waterlogged subway ceilings collapse. Within 20 years, the water-soaked steel columns that support the street above the east side 4, 5 and 6 trains corrode and buckle. As Legiston's Avenue caves in, it becomes a river. Well before then, however, payments all over the town would have already been in trouble. According to Dr. Jamil Ahmed, chairman of the Civil Engineering Department at the New York Cooper Union, things will begin to fall apart during the first month of the March after the humans vacate Manhattan. Each March, temperatures normally flutters back and forth around 32 degrees Fahrenheit as many as 40 times. Presumably, the climate changes could push this back to February. Whenever it is, the repeated freezing and thawing makes an asphalt and cement spilled. When show the thaws, water seeps into these fresh cracks. When it freezes, the water expands and cracks widen. call it water irritations for being squashed under all that cityscape. Almost every other compound in nature contracts when frozen, but H2O molecule do the opposite, organizing themselves into an elegant hexagonal crystal that takes up about 9% more space than they did when sloshing around its liquid state. Pretty six-sided crystals suggested snowflakes, so Gossamer it hard to convince of them pushing apart slabs of sidewalks. It gauzemakers it hard to conceive of them pushing apart slabs of sidewalks. It's even more difficult to imagine the carbon steel water pipe to build within stand 7,500 pounds of pressure per square inch exploding when they freeze. Yet that actually what happens. As pavement separates, weeds like mustards, shamrocks, and the goosegrass blows in from the central park and works their way down the new cracks, which widen the further in the current world before they get too far. City maintenance usually shows up, kills the weed, and fills the fissures. But in the post people world, there is no one left the continuously path New York. The weed are followed by the city's most prolific exotic species, the Chinese Alethtian trees. Even with the 8 million people around, Alethus, otherwise innocently known as the tree of the heaven, or implacable invaders capable of rooting in tiny chinks in a subway tunnel, unnoticed until their spreading leaf coniferous start poking from the sidewalk's grades. With no one to young their seedlings, within 5 years, powerful Alethans roots are heaving upside walks and wreaking havoc in sewers, which are already stressed by all the plastic bags and the old newspaper mess that no one is clearing away. As soil long trapped beneath the pavement gets exposed to the sun and rain, other species jump in, and soon leaf litters adds to the rising piles of debris clogging the sewer grates. The early pioneer plants won't even have to wait for the pavement to fall apart. Starting from the mulch collections in the gutters, a layer of a soil will start forming atop New York's sterile hard shells, and seedling will sprout with far less organic material available to it. Just wind blown dust and urban shoot. Precisely that has happened in an abundant elevated iron bed of an New York Central Railroad on Mahananda's west side. Since trains stopped running there in 1980s, the inevitable Alethus trees have been joined by then thickening ground cover of an onion grass and fuzzy lamp ear, accented by the stands of an golden rock. In some places, the track emerges from the second stories of an warehouse it once serviced into elevated lanes of the wild courses irises, evening primroses, asters, and the Queen Anne's lace. So many New Yorkers glancing down from the window in Chesapeake art districts were moved by the sight of its untended, flowering green ribbon, probatively and swiftly laying the claim to a dead slice of their city, that it was dubbed the Highline, unofficially designated a park. In the first few years, with no heat, pipes burst all over town. The freeze Thaw cycles moves indoor and the thing starts to seriously deteriorate. Building groan as their innards expands and contrasts. Joints between the walls and the roofline separates. Where they do, the rain leaks in bolt rust and facing the pops off, exposing the installations. If the city hasn't burned yet, it will come now. Collectively, New York architecture isn't an constable as says as San Francisco's integratory rows of an clubboard Victorians. But with no fireman's to answer to call, a dry lighting strikes that ignites a decade of an dead branches, and leaving the piling up in Central Park will spread the flames through the city. Within 2 decades, lightning rods have begun to rust and snap, and the roof fires leap upon the building, entering a paneled offices filled with an paper fuel. Gas line ignites with a rush of an flames that blows out the window. Rain and an slope blows in, and soon even pour concentrate flows are freezing, thawing, and starting to buckle. Burnt insulation and charred wood add the nutrients to Mahadan's growing soil cap. Native Virginia creepers and the poison ivy claws at walls covered with the lynches which thrive in the absence of air pollution. Red-tailed hawks and peregrine falcons next in incredibly sketchy high-rise structures. Within 2 centuries, estimate the Brooklyn Botanical Garden Vice President Stephen Clements colonizing the trees will have substantially replaced pioneer weeds. Gutters buried under the tons of a leaf lifters littler provider new. Fertile grounds for the native oaks and maple from a city parks. Arriving black lost and autumn olive shrubs fix nitrogens, allowing the sunflower, busstems, and the white snake roots to move in along with an apple trees. Unless respond some equal eminence, scientists who have been eyeing the Arctic meltwater from Greenland ice cap chills the Gulf Stream to a halt, closing down the great ocean conveyor belt that circulates warm water around the globe. That won't bring an ice age back to Europe and the east coast of North American after free. Maybe not severe enough to trigger a massive sheet glaciers, but treeless tundra and permafrost could become the alternative to the temperature forest. The berry bushes would be reduced to stunted, colorful spot of a ground covers among the reindeer lynches attracting caribou southwards. In a third wishful scenario, the two extremes might blunt each other enough to hold the temperature suspended in between. Whichever it is, hot or cold or betwixt, in a world where the human stayed around and pushed atmospheric carbon to 500 to 600 parts per million, or the projected 900 ppm by the AD 21,000. If we change nothing from the way we do the business today, much of what once lay frozen atop Greenland will be sloshing in an solvent Atlantic, depending on exactly how much of it and Antarcticas go. Manhattan might become no more than a few islets, one where the great hill one rose above the Central Park, another an outcropping of a cyst in an Washington height. For a while, clutches of a building a few miles to the south would vainly scan the surrounding water like surfacing the periscopes until buffing waves brought them down. Ice Eden. Had humans never evolved, how might the planet have fared? Or was it inevitable that we did? And if we disappeared would occur, we or something equally complicated happens again. Far from either pole, East African Lake Tanganyika lies in a crack that 15 million years ago began to split America into two. The Great African Rift Valley is a connecting of an technical parting of a way that begins even earlier in what and how Lebanon's Bekaa Valley, then ran south through the form the course of an Jordan River and the Dead Sea. Then it winded into the Red Sea and is now branching down the two parallel cleavage through the crust of Africa. Lake Tanganyika fills the rift western fork for 450 miles, making it the longest lake in the world. Nearly a mile from the surface to the bottom, around 10 million years older. It is also the world's second deepest and world's oldest. African Siberia Lake Baikal. That makes it extremely interesting to the scientists who have been extracting core samples of a lake bed sediments. Just as annual snowfall preserves a history of a climate in the glaciers, pollen grains from the surrounding foliage settle in the deep often bodies of fresh water, neatly separated into readable layers by the dark bands of rainy seasons, runoff, and the light seams of dry season algal blooms. At ancient Lake Tanganyika, the core reveal more than the identities of the plant. They show how a jungle gradually turns to the fire tolerant, broad-leaved woodland known as Mimobe, which covers the vast swathes of today's Africa. Mayobo is another man-made artifact which develops a Catholic human discovered that by burning the trees they could create in grassland and open woodlands to attract and nurture the antipole. Mixed with the thickening layers of charcoal, the pollen shows the even greater deforestation that accompanied the drawing of the Iron Age. As humans learned first to smelt ore, then to fashion hoes for the furrows, there they planted crops such as finger millets, whose signature also appears. Later arrivals, little beans and corns, produce either to fallen the pollen or grains, too large to drift far. But the spread of an agriculture is evident by the increase of an pollen from fern, the colonies distributed land. All this is more can be learned from the mud recovered with 10 meters of an steel pipe lowered on an cable and aided by a vibrator motor driven from the force of its own weight into the lake bed and into 1 lakh years of pollen layers. A next year step, says the University of Arizona paleontologist Andy Cohen, who heads a research project in Kihoma, Tanzania on Lake Tanganyika eastern shore, is a drill rig cabbage of an penetrating a 5 million or even 10 million year core. Such a mission would be very expensive, on the order of a small oil drilling barrage. The lake is so deep that the drill could not be anchored. Reculed thrusters linked to an global poisoning system to constantly adjust it positive above the hole. But it would be worth it, says Cohen, because this is the Earth's longest, richest climate archive. It has long been assumed that the climate is driven by advancing and recreating the polar ice sheet. But there is a good reason to believe that the circulations at the tropics is also involved. We knew a lot about the climate changes at the poles, but not at the heat engine of the planet. Whether people live coring it, Kanhan says that would capture 10 minutes the climate history found in glaciers with a far greater precision. There is a probably 100 different things we can analyze. Among them is the history of an human evolution, because the core record would span the years during which primates took their first bipedal steps and proceed through the transgender stages that lead the hominids from the Australopithecus to Homo habilis, erectus, and finally sapiens. The pollens would be the same that our ancestors inhaled, and even broadcast from the same plant they touched and ate, because they too emerged from this drift. East of an lake Tanzania in the African Rift parallel branch, another lake Slovers and saline evaporated and reappeared various times over the past 2 million years. Today it is grassland, hard grazed by the cows and the goats of massy herdsmen, overlying a sandstone, clay, tuff, and an ash atop of a bed of volcanic basalt. A streaking draining Tanzania volcanic highlights to the east gradually cut a gorge through those layers 100 meters deep. There, during the 20th century, archaeologists Lewis and Mary Leakey discovered the fossil humanoid skull left 1.75 million years earlier. The grey rubble of an Olduvai gorge, now a semi-desert bristling with a sessile, eventually yielded hundreds of the stone flake tools and chopper cores made from the underlying basalts. Some of these have been dated to 2 million years ago. In 1978, 25 miles southwest of an Olduvai gorge, Mary Leakey's team found a trail of an footprints frozen in a wet ash. They were made by an Australopithecus, likely parents and a child, walking or fleeting through the rainy aftermath of an eruption of the nearby Stadium volcano. Their discovery pushed the bipedal hominoid extinctions back beyond 3.5 million years ago. From here and from related sites in Kenya and Ethiopia, a pattern emerges of an gestation of the human race. It is now known that we walked on 2 feet for the hundreds of the thousands of years before it occurred. To us, to strike one stone against another to create a sharp-edged tool. From the remains of an humanoid teeth and the other nearby fossils, we know we are omnivorous, equipped with the molars to crush nuts. But also, as we advanced from finding stones tapped like axes to the learning how to produce them, possessed often means to efficiently kill and eat animals. Olduvai gorge and the other fossil humanoid sites, together comparing a crescent that runs south from Ethiopia and parallel the continent eastern shore, have confirmed beyond much doubt that we all are Africans. The dust we breathe here, blown by Zethopteris, that leaves a coating of a grey stuff powder on Olduvai silus and axis, contain a classified peak of an very DNA that we carry. From this place, human radiates across the continents and around a planet. Eventually, coming full circle, we return so estranged from our origin that we enslave the blood cousins who stayed behind to maintain our birthright. Animal bones in these places, some from hippo, rhino, horse and elephant species that became existent as we multiplied. Many of them honored by our ancestors into the pointed tools and weapons, help us know how the world was just before we emerged from the rest of mammalia. What they don't show, however, it is what might have impelled us to do so. But a Lake Tanganyika, these are some clues. They leak back to the ice. The lake is fed by many streams that pour off a mile high rift escarpment. At one point, these dropped through the gallery rainforest. Then came a Miambo woodlands. Today, most of an escarpment has no trees at all. Its slopes have been cleared to the plant cassava, with the fields so steep that farmers are known to roll off them. An expectation is that Gombe stream on a lake Tanganyika eastern Tanzanian coast, the site where the primatologist Jane Goodall, a Leakey assistant at Olivia George, has studied the chimpanzees since 1960. Her field study, the longest anywhere, of how a species behaved in the wild, in the headquartered in a cramped, reachable only by the boat. The national park that surrounds it is in Tanzania, smallest, only 52 square miles. When Goodall first arrived, the surrounding hills were covered in jungle. It is open into the woodland and savanna, lions and Cape buffalo lived. Today the park is surrounded on the three sides by casa fields, oil palms plantation, hill settlements, and up and down the lake shore, several villages of more than 5,000 inhabitants. The famous chimpanzees population teeters precautionally around 90. Although chimps are the most intensive studied primates at Go, its rainforest is also a home to many olive baboons and several monkey species, vervet, red clawbirds, redtail, and the blue. During 2005, a PhD candidate at New York University Centers for the Study of Human Organism named Kite Dwelterile spent several months investigating an odd phenomenon involved the last two. Red-tailed monkey have a small black faces, white spotted nose, white cheeks, and a vivid chestnut tails. Blue monkey have the bluish coat and a triangular, nearly naked face with impressive jutting eyebrows. With different coloring, body size, and the vocalization, no one would confuse a blue and a red-tailed monkey in the field. Yet in the Gom, they now apparently mistake one another because they have begun to interbreed. So far, Dweteller has confirmed that although the two species have a different number of chromosomes, at least some of the offsprings of these liaisons were between the blue males and the red-tailed females, or vice versa, are fertile. From the forest floor, she scraps her feet, in which fragments of an intestinal lining attest to mix of an DNA resulting in a new hybrid. One day she thinks that it is something more. Genetics indicate that at some point 3 million to the 5 million years ago, two populations of a species that was the common ancestors to those two monkeys being separated. Adjusting a distinct environment, they gradually diverged from each other. Through a similar situation involving a finch population that became isolated on various Galapagos Islands. Charles Darwin first deduced how evolution works. In the case, 13 different finch species emerged in response to the locally available food. Their bills variously adapted to cracking seeds, eating insects, extracting the catgut pulp, or even sucking the bloods of an sea bird. In the Goomp, the opposite have apparently occurred. At some point, as new forest filled the barriers that one divided those two species, they found themselves sharing a nice. But then they became marooned together as the forest surrounding Goomp National Park gave away to Kasavi Corpo land. As the numbers of available mates of their own species dwindled, fingers, these animals have been driven to the desperate or creative survival measures. Here there is it their hybridization between the two species can be an evolution any force. Just like the natural selection is within one. Maybe at the first that mixed offsprings isn't a fit as either parents, she says, but for whatever reasons, constrained habitat or low numbers, the experiment keeps getting repeated until eventually a hybrid as viable as its parents emerges. Or maybe even if with the advantages over the parents because the habitat have changed. That would make the future offspring of those monkey human are fact. The parents forced together by agriculture Homo sapiens who so fragmented East Africa that population of a monkey and other species like shrikes and the flycatchers had to be interbreed, crossbreed, perish, or do something that were creative, such as evolve. Something similar maybe happened here before. Once, when a rift was only beginning to form, Africa's tropical forest filled the continent's midriff from the Indian Ocean to the Atlantic. Great apes have already made their appearance, including one that, in many ways, resembles chimpanzees. No remnants of it have ever been found, for the same reason that the chimps remains are so rare. In the tropical forest, heavy rain leaches the minerals from the ground before anything can fossils, and bones decompose quickly. Yet scientists have its existence because genetics shows that we and chimps descended directly from the same ancestors. The American physical anthropology Richard Warman have given this undiscovered ape a name as Pan prior. Prior that it is to Pran trio digest today's chimpanzees, but also prior to a great dry spell that overtook Africa about 7 million years ago. Wetlands retreated, soils dried, lakes disappeared, and forests shrank into pocket refuges separated by the savannas. What caused this was an ice age advancing from the poles, with much of the world's moistures locked into glaciers that buried Greenland, Scandinavia, Russia, and much of North America. Africa became parched. No ice sheets reached it, although glacial caps formed on volcanoes like Kilimanjaro and Mount Kenya. But the climatic change that fragmented Africa's forest more than twice the size of today's Amazon was due to the same distant white juggernaut that was smacking confer in this path. That far away ice sheet strangled population of an African mammals and the birds in the patches of forest where, over the next few million years, they evolved their separate ways. At least one of them we know was driven to try something daring, taking a stroll in an savannas. If human vanished and if something eventually replaced us, would it become as we did? In southwest Uganda, there is a place where it is possible to see our history replicated in the microsomes. Chambora Gorge is a narrow ravine that cuts for 10 miles through a deposit of a dark brown volcanic ash on the floor of the Rift Valley. In startling contrast to the surrounding yellow plains, a green band of an tropical sobo, ironwood, and leaf flower trees fills this canyon along the Chambora River. For chimpanzees, this oasis is both a refuge and a crocodile. Lash as it is, the gorge is barely 500 yards across. It is available the fruit too limited to satisfy all their dietary needs. So for the time, brave ones risk climbing up the canopy and leaping to the rim to the chancy rim of the ground. With no ladders of branches to help them see over the oat and the clonidal grasses, they must raise themselves on 2 feet. From a moment on the verge of being bipedal, they scamper for the lions and the hyenas among the scattered fig trees on the savannas. They select a tree they calculate they can reach without becoming food themselves. Then, as we also once did, they run for it. About 3 million years after the distinct glaciers pushed some courageous, hungry specimens of Panpyreus out of a forest no longer big enough to sustain us, and some of them proved imaginative enough to survive. The world won again. Ice retreated, trees regained their former ground, and then some, even covering the Iceland. Forests reunited across Africa, again from the Atlantic shore to the Indian, but by the Panpyreor had segued into something new. The first act to prefer the grassy woodlands at the forest edge. After more than 1 million years of walking on the 2 feet, its legs has been lengthened and its opposite big toes have shortened. It was losing the ability to dwell in trees, but its sharpened survival skill on the ground have taught it to do such more things. Now we are humanoid. Somewhere along the way, an Australopithecines were becoming Homo. We learned not only to follow the fire that opened up savannas that we have learned to inhabit, but how to make them ourselves. For some 3 million years more, we were too few to create more than the local patchworks of a grassland and the forest whenever distant ice age weren't doing it for us. Yet in that time, long before the Panpyreus must reason designate, surnamed the sapiens appeared. We must have become numerous enough to again try being pioneer. We were the humanoids who wandered out of Africa again, intrepid risk takers, the imagination picturing even more bounty beyond the savanna horizon. Or we were the losers, temporarily outcompacted by the tribes of an stronger blood cousins for the right to say in an cradle. Or they simply go forth and multiplying like any beast presented with the rice researchers, such as grassland stretching all the way to Asia. As Darwin came to appreciate, it didn't matter. When isolated groups from the same species processed in their separate ways, the most successful among them learned to flourish in new surroundings. Exiles or the adventurers, the one who survived, filled Asia Minor and then India. In Europe and Asia, they began to develop a skill long known to temperature creature like the squirrels but new to primitive plannings, which requires both memory and foresight to store food in a season of plenty in order to outlet the season of cold. A large bridge got them through much of Indonesia, but to reach the New Guinea and about 5 lakh years ago, Australia, they had to learn become a seafarers. And then 11,000 years ago, observant Homo sapiens in the Middle East figured out a secret until that known only to select the species of insects. How to control the food supplies not by destroying the plants but by nurturing them. Because we know Middle East origin of a wheat and barley they grow, which soon spread southwards along the Nile, we can guess that, like a shrewd Jacob returning with a cornucopia of the gift to win over his powerful brother Yeshua, someone bearing the seeds and the knowledge of the agriculture returned. From there to the Africa's homeland, it was an auspicious time to do so, because at another ice ages, the last one had one again stolen moisture from the land that glaciers didn't reach, tightening the food supplies so much the water was frozen into the glaciers that the ocean were 300 feet lower than today. At the same time, other humans who have kept spreading across the Asias arrived at the farthest reach of Siberia. With the Bering Sea partially uncovered, a land bridge 1,000 millions across connected to Alaska. For 10,000 years, it had laid under more than a half of a mile of ice, but now enough had receded to reveal an ice-free corridors in a place 30 miles wide. Picking their way around meltwater lakes, they crossed it. Khambura Gorge and Combi Stream are allots in an archaeopologia that is all that remains of a forest that birthed us. This time, the fragmentation of an African ecosystem is due not to the glaciers, but to ourselves in our latest evolutionary leap to the status of a force of nature, having become as powerful as volcanoic and the ice sheet. In these forest islands, surrounded by the sea of an agriculture and the settlement, the lost of Panpraeus, other offspring still cling to a life as it was when we left to become the woodland, savanna, and finally the city apes. To the north of Congo River, our siblings are gorillas and the chimpanzees, to the south bonobos. It is the latter two were genetically most resemblable. When Louis T.K. sent Jan a Goodall to the Goom, it was because the bones and the skull he and his wife have uncovered suggested that our common ancestors would have looked and acted much like chimpanzees. Whatever impressed our forebears to leave, their decision ignited an evolutionary burst unlike any before, described variously as the most successfully and most destructive the world have ever seen. But suppose we have stayed, or suppose that when we are exposed on the savannas, the ancestors of today's lion and hyenas have made the short work of us. What if anything would have evolved in our place? To stare into the eyes of chimpanzees in the wild is to glimpse the world had we have stayed in the forest. Their thoughts may be observed, but their intelligence is unmistakable. A chimpanzee in his element, regarding you coolly from a branch of an mubla fruit tree, expresses no sense of inferiority in the presence of a superior primitive. Hollywood images mislead because it is trained chimps are all juvenile veins, as cute as any child. However, they keep growing sometimes reaching 120 pounds. In a human of a similar weight, about 30 pounds of this would be fat. A wild chimpanzee who lives in an perpetual state of an gymnasis has perhaps 3 to 4 pounds of fat. The rest is muscle. Dr. Michael Wilson, the curly haired young director of a field researches at the Gombe Street, vouches for his strength. He has watched them depart and detour red columned monkey. Superb hunter, about 80% of their attempts are successful kills. For lion, it was only about 1 out of 10 or 20. These are pretty bite creatures, but he has also seen them steal into the terrorists of a neighboring chip groups, ambush unwary longly male and mutinate them to the death. He watched chimpanzees over a month patiently pick off the males of an neighboring clans until the territory and the females are there. He is also seen pitched chimpanzees combat and blood battles with a group to determine who is alpha male. The unavoidable comprises to human acceleration and the power struggle became his research specialty. I get tired of thinking about it. It's a kind of depression. One of the unfathomables is my Bohomes, smaller and more slender than the chimps but equally related to us. Don't seem very aggressive at all. Although they defend a territory, no intergroup killings have ever been observed. Their peaceful nature precluding for an playful sex with multiple partners, an apparent martial social organization with all the attendant narrating have partially become mythologized among those who insistently hope that the meek might you inherit the earth. In a world without a human, however, if they have to fight it or with the chimpanzees, they would be outnumbered. Only 10,000 over a fewer bonobos remain, compared to 150,000 chimpanzees. Since a combined population a century ago was approximately 20 times a greater, which each passing year changes weaken for their either species to be around to take over. Michael Wilson, hiking in the rainforest, hears a drum beats that he knows are chimpanzees pounding on an butt tree's root. Signaling each other's, he ran after them. Up and down Gombe 13th Stream Valley, hurdling morning glory vines and linen strung across the baboons' trails. Following the chimps' hoot until 2 hours later, he finally catches them at the top of a rift. 5 of them are in a tree at the edge of the woodlands, eating the mangoes they love, a fruit that came along with a wheat from Arabia. A mile below, Lake Tanganyika flashes in the afternoon sunlight, so that it holds 20% of the world's freshwater and so many endemic fish species that it's known as among aquatic biologists as the gallopins of the lake. Beyond it, to the west, are the Hazels Hill of an Congo, where the chimpanzees are still taken for the bush meat. In the opposite direction, past Gombe borders, are farmers who also have rifles and who are tired of chips, who snatches their old oil palm nuts. Other than humans and each other, the chimpanzees have no real predators here. The very presence of these 5 in a tree surrounded by the grass testifies to the fact that they have also inherited the gene of an adaflated city and are far more able than the gorillas, which have highly specialized for forest diets, to live on a variety of a food and in a variety of an environments. If humans were gone, however, they might not need to, because, says Williamson, the forest would come back fast. There would be the Mimbo moving through the area, recovering the kava fields. Probably the bamboo would take a first advantage, radiating out, carrying the seeds in their pulp, which they have planted. Soon you would have a trees sprouting wherever there suitable habitat. Eventually the chimps would follow. With plenty of game returning, lions would find their way back. Then the big animals, cap buffalo and the elephant coming from the Tanzania and Uganda reserves. Eventually, Wilson says, citing, I can see a continuous stretch of chimpanzees population all the way down to Malawi, all the way to Burundi and over into Congo. All that forest back again, ripe with chimpanzees' favorite fruits and prospering population often red colobus to catch. In tiny Gombe, a prostate shred of an African's past that is also a taste of such a postman future. No enticement is really invented for another primitive to leave all that lushness and follow in our fertile footsteps, until of course the ice returns. The lost menarige. In a dream, you walked outside to find your familiar landscape swanning with a fantastic being. Depending on where you live, there might be deers within antlers thick as the tree bow, or something resembling a live armored tank. That is a herd of what looks like camels, except they have trunks. Furry rhinoceros, big hairy elephants, and even bigger sloth. Wild horses of all sizes and stripes. Patterns with the 7-inch wagons and alarmingly tall cheetahs. Wolves, bears, and the lion so huge this must be a nightmare, a dream, or an memory. This were purely the world that the Homo sapiens stepped into as we spread beyond Africa, all the way to America. Had we never appeared, would those now missing mammals still be there? If we go, will they be back? Among the various slugs hurdle at sitting presenting throughout the history of the United States, the epithet with which Thomas Jefferson Forbes smeared him in 1808 was unique. Mr. Mammoth, an imago that the Jeffersons slapped on all the foreign trade, intended to punish Britain and the France for monopolizing shipping lanes, had backfired. While the US economy was collapsing, its opponent sneered. President Jefferson could be found in an east room of a White House playing with his fossil collections. This was true. Jefferson, a fascinate neutralist, have been enthralled for years by reports of an huge bone strewn around a salt lick in the Kentucky wilderness. Descriptions suggested that they were similar to remains discovered in Siberia of a species of an giant elephant, though the European scientists to be existent. African slaves have recognized the big molars found in an Carolinas as belonging to some kind of elephants, and the Jeffersons was sure these all were the same. In 1796, he received a shipment supposed of an mammoth bones from an Greenbrier country, Virginia, but a huge claw immediately altered him that this was something else, possibly some immense breed of lion. Consulting anatomist, he eventually identified it as credited for the first description of an North America ground sloth, today named as Megapholis jeffersoni. The most existing to him, though, were testimonies by Indians near the Kentucky Salt Lake, allegedly collaborated by the other tribes farther west. Then the Tusker Behemoth in the question still lived in the north. After he became the president, he sent a Meriwether Lewis to study the Kentucky site on the way to joining William Clark for their historic mission. Jefferson have charged Lewis and Clark not only with traversing the Louisiana Purchase and seeking a northwest river route to the Pacific, but also with finding lives in mammoth, mastodons, or anything similarly large and unusual. The part of their otherwise stunning expeditions proved a failure. The most impressive big mammals they sighted was the bighorn sheep. Jefferson later contented himself with sending a Clark back to Kentucky for the mammoth bones that he displayed in the White House, today part of museum collections in the United States and the France. He is often credited with founding the science of pathology, though it was not really in his intentions. He had hoped to be belief and opinion. He possessed by a prominent French scientist that everything in the New World was inferior to the Old, including its wildlife. He was also fundamentally mistaken about the meaning of fossil bones. He was convinced that they must belong to a living species because he didn't believe that anything ever went extinct. Although often considered America's quintessential age of Enlightenment intellectual, Jefferson's belief corresponded to these held by Mennonites and the Christians of his day, that in a perfect creation nothing created was ever intended to disappear. He articulated the stereo, however, as an neutralist. Such is the economy of a nature that no instance can be produced or her having permitted any one race of an animal to be existent. It was a wish that imbued many of his writings. He wanted these animals to be alive, wanted to know them. His quiet for the knowledge led him to found the University of Virginia. Over the next 2 centuries, paleontologists there and elsewhere would show how these extensions were part of nature itself, one variety morphing into the next to the meet changing conditions, another losing its nice to more powerful competitors. Yet one details have nagged at Thomas Jefferson's and other after him was that the big mammal remains turning up didn't seem all that old. These weren't heavily mineralized fossils embedded in the solid layers of the rock.